Jess and I have been best friends since we were 8 years old, 21 years. She was the maid of honor at my wedding. I was there when her mother died. We have the kind of friendship where there are no secrets, where the history is so long and deep that you can reference things from 4th grade, and both of you know exactly what you're talking about. Which is why what happened 3 years ago, when I brought up the library, still sits wrong with me. We were visiting her parents for the holidays, driving back from dinner, and something on the radio mentioned the name of our elementary school. Clarendon Elementary, tiny school in a small Vermont town. The kind where you have the same 20 kids in your class from kindergarten through 6th grade, and you all know each other's families. Jess smiled and said something about how small it was, and I said, "Do you remember that day in the library?" And she said, "Which day?" I said, "The day we both saw the woman in the basement window." Jess looked at me. She said she didn't know what I was talking about. I was so sure she'd know. So completely certain that this was a shared memory. The kind that lives in a specific place in your history with someone. The kind you've both been carrying without discussing for 20 years. It hadn't occurred to me for even a moment that she might not remember it. I described it. Grade 4, winter. We'd stayed after school to return books to the library, which was in the basement of the main building. The custodian had already locked up, and we'd been given a key by our teacher to drop the books through the slot. But the slot was jammed, and we'd had to go around the outside of the building to the basement window to see if anyone was still inside. There was someone inside. A woman standing in the middle of the library, facing away from the window. Dark clothing. Still. The library was supposed to be empty. We had watched her for probably 30 seconds, both of us side by side, faces pressed to the cold glass of the basement window. I looked at Jess, and Jess looked at me, and without saying anything, we both understood at the same moment that we needed to leave. We walked away fast, and by the time we got to the corner of the building, we were running, and we ran all the way to the parking lot where Jess's mother was waiting, and we got in the car and said nothing. We never talked about it. I always assumed we'd never talked about it because we both knew what we'd seen, and neither of us wanted to. The unspoken understanding of two 10-year-olds who had agreed, wordlessly, to file something away and not open the drawer again. But Jess was looking at me in the passenger seat of that car, and her face had the expression of someone genuinely trying to locate a memory that wasn't there. She said she didn't remember any of it. Not the books, not the key, not the window, not the woman, not running to her mother's car. She said she remembered that winter. She remembered things from 4th grade. She could describe the classroom and their teacher and a field trip they'd taken to Burlington. She just didn't remember that day. I told her that was impossible. I described it again in more detail. The time of day, the cold, the specific quality of the light through the basement window, the way the woman was standing, the fact that we both ran. Jess said, "I believe you. I believe something happened. I just genuinely don't have it." We sat with that for a while. Then she said something that I have turned over and over since. She said, "Do you think there's a reason I don't remember?" I asked what she meant. She said, "I don't know. I just wonder sometimes if there are things your mind decides you don't need. Things it takes away because keeping them would cost too much." I didn't say anything, but I thought about that for the whole drive back, and I've been thinking about it for 3 years since. Because here's what I know about that day that I've never told Jess. The part that goes beyond what we both saw through the window. When we ran to her mother's car, I looked back. Just once, just at the corner of the building when we were almost around it, I looked back at the basement window. The woman was facing the window now. She was watching us run. And here's the thing about Jess's theory, the thing that keeps me up sometimes. If there are things the mind takes away because keeping them costs too much, that means the mind makes a calculation. It assesses the cost and decides whether you can afford to carry it. Jess couldn't afford it. I could. The question I've been sitting with for 3 years is not why Jess doesn't remember. It's what the difference is between us. Because we were both 10 years old. We were both there. We both saw the same woman through the same window at the same moment. But only one of us ran without looking back. And only one of us has been carrying this for 20 years. And I've never been able to decide whether Jess got lucky or whether I did. There's a thing that happens when you're a child that doesn't happen when you're an adult. When you see something frightening, something your brain can't categorize, you don't have the same instinct to disbelieve your own eyes. Adults dismiss. Children just see. I saw a man in the hallway of our house for 3 years, from age 7 to age 10. He stood at the far end of the upstairs hallway near the linen closet, and he was there on some nights and not others, and he never moved, and he never came closer, and he never did anything except stand there facing my bedroom door. My bedroom was at the near end of the hall. His end was maybe 20 feet away. I told my mother the first time I saw him. She came upstairs, checked the hallway, found nothing, and told me it was a dream. I told her I hadn't been asleep. She said I'd been half asleep, which is what parents say when they need the conversation to end. I stopped telling her after the second time because her explanation was always the same, and the man was always still there. Here's what I remember about him, precisely, the way you remember things that scared you badly enough to carve themselves in permanently. He was tall, taller than my father, who was 6 feet, which meant the man came close to the hallway ceiling. He wore dark clothing. He stood facing my direction with his arms at his sides, and he had no face, not a blur, not a shadow obscuring features. No face, smooth and featureless and pale, like a doll before the face is painted on. He never moved. In 3 years of seeing him on and off, he never took a step, never turned his head. He just stood at the end of the hall and faced me, and I would pull my blanket up and close my eyes, and by morning he was always gone. I want to be clear about something. I am 31 years old. I am a pediatric nurse. I understand childhood psychology, sleep paralysis, hypnagogic hallucinations, the ways fear and darkness and developing brains can produce images that feel completely real. I have explained these things to parents at work. I believe in them. I also believe I saw a man in that hallway. Both things are true, and they sit next to each other in my memory, and I have made a kind of peace with the fact that I cannot resolve them. What I cannot make peace with is what I found out 12 years after we moved out of that house. My mother developed a close friendship with the woman who bought the house from us. They stayed in touch for years. Last Christmas, at a family dinner, my mother mentioned this woman and said she'd recently heard from her. She said the woman's youngest daughter had apparently been having trouble sleeping, kept saying there was someone in the hallway upstairs. I put my fork down. I asked my mother how old the daughter was. She said 7. I sat at that table and did not say anything for a long time. my mother didn't notice. The conversation moved on. Nobody knew what I was doing, which was sitting very still and doing arithmetic. The family had lived in that house for 12 years before this started for their daughter, which meant whatever stood at the end of that hallway had waited. It had been there when we lived in the house. It had been there through another family's tenancy. And now it was there for a 7-year-old girl who was pulling her blankets up at night and looking at the end of the hall and seeing something that nobody else could see. The same end of the hall, the same age. I don't know why 7. I don't know what 7 means to it. I don't know if it matters. What I know is that I never told my mother about the 3 years I spent watching the end of that hallway. I never told her what I saw clearly enough for her to carry the image the way I carry it. So, when she mentioned the little girl, she had no reason to connect it to anything I'd experienced. She thought she was just passing along neighborhood news. She didn't see my face. I have thought about calling the woman who owns the house. I have picked up my phone and put it down again more times than I can count. What would I say? Yes, there is something in your hallway. Yes, it has been there for at least 24 years that I know of. Yes, your daughter is seeing it clearly, exactly as clearly as I did, and she is right about everything she is telling you. I haven't called, because I don't know what to do with the answer to the question I'd have to ask next. Whether it ever came closer. Whether it stopped at the end of the hall. For me, it always stopped there. For 3 years, it stood at the end of the hall and never moved. But I moved out when I was 12. I don't know what happened after I left, and the little girl at the end of that hall is 7 years old, and she has more time in that house than I did. And I don't know if it stays at the end of the hall for her, or if it moves. When I was 9 years old, I used to cut through Mr. Callahan's backyard on the way home from school. Not because it was faster, it was actually longer than the road. I did it because of the apple tree at the far corner of his yard, a big old tree that dropped apples every September and that Mr. Callahan never seemed to pick up. I would grab one on the way through, wipe it on my shirt, and eat it before I got home. This happened maybe 3 times a week through September and into October. Mr. Callahan never said anything about it. He was an old man who lived alone and mostly stayed inside, and I had the vague understanding of children that he was the kind of person you did not bother. The thing I saw happened on a Thursday afternoon in October when I was 9. I'm 34 now, and I can still place it precisely. Thursday, late afternoon, the light already going orange and low the way it does in Kentucky in October. The kind of light that makes everything look like the last day of something. I had come through the gap in the fence, grabbed my apple, and was cutting diagonally across the yard toward the other fence when I looked up at the house. Mr. Callahan was at the kitchen window. I had seen him at the window before. He would sometimes watch me from there, not in a threatening way, just the watching of someone who doesn't get out much and finds the presence of other people mildly interesting. I was used to it. I would usually wave and he would usually nod, and that was the extent of our interaction. But that Thursday, he was not watching me. He was facing the window, but he wasn't looking out. He was looking at something inside the kitchen, something to his left, and his expression was wrong. I was 9, and I didn't have words for what was wrong about it, but I know now. The expression on his face was fear, complete, undisguised, adult fear on the face of an old man in his own kitchen. He was holding very still, both hands flat on the counter in front of him, not gripping, just flat, like he was bracing, like he needed the solid surface of the counter to stay upright. And he was looking at something to his left that I could not see from outside because the window only showed the center of the kitchen. I stood in his yard and I watched him for probably 30 seconds. He didn't look at me. He didn't seem to know I was there. He was completely focused on whatever was to his left, in the part of the kitchen I couldn't see. Then he closed his eyes. He stood there with his eyes closed and both hands flat on the counter and whatever was in the kitchen with him. I don't know what it was. It was in the room with him, and he was standing at the counter with his eyes closed, and he did not move. I left. I went through the fence and went home, and I didn't tell anyone because I was 9, and I didn't have the words for what I'd seen, and also because I had been cutting through his yard and taking his apples, and telling my parents would have required explaining that. I didn't cut through his yard after that. I went back to the road. 2 weeks later, Mr. Callahan was not at the window. 3 weeks after that, my mother mentioned at dinner that old Mr. Callahan had passed away. She said he'd been found by his son, that he'd died peacefully, that he'd been getting on in years, and it wasn't unexpected. Died peacefully. I was 9, and I accepted that. I'm 34 now. I've thought about that kitchen window many times since, about the expression on his face, about the way he was standing with his hands flat on the counter and his eyes closed, not fighting, not running, just standing there, enduring something. Here is what I understand now that I didn't at 9. When adults are frightened, really frightened, not startled but deeply frightened, they go still. It's not paralysis, it's a decision, conscious or not. You stop moving because movement draws attention and you are trying not to draw attention. You close your eyes because seeing it makes it more real, and you have decided that making it less real is the only thing you have left. Mr. Callahan knew exactly what was in his kitchen. He had closed his eyes not because he didn't know, but because he'd seen it enough times that he'd made a decision about how to get through it. He had been living with whatever it was. For how long, I don't know. Long enough that standing at the counter with his eyes closed was a coping strategy. Long enough that it had become routine. 2 weeks after I saw him at that window, he was gone. I don't know what he died of. My mother said peacefully, and I never asked further, and the town never said otherwise. He was old. Old people die. But I stood in his yard, and I saw the look on his face, and I have spent 25 years trying to put it somewhere that doesn't wake me up sometimes. Whatever was in that kitchen, he was not surprised by it. He had stopped being surprised by it a long time ago. That's the part I can't get past, not the fear on his face, the resignation underneath it, the look of a man who has made his peace with something that will not leave him alone, and who has decided that closing his eyes is the closest he can get to being somewhere else. I took his apples for a whole September, and I never knew. He stood at that window and watched me cut through his yard and eat his apples, and I was the most ordinary thing in his life. And I had no idea what was standing in the room behind him.